Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we are traveling back further than we have ever gone before. Further back than ancient Rome, or ancient Egypt, or ancient Greece. Further back than the Ice Age. Further back than the first cities, or the first writing, or the first farmers. Tonight, we are going all the way back to the beginning. To the very first chapter of the human story, the Stone Age. It is the longest chapter by an enormous distance. Everything that human beings have built and created and discovered since then, every city and every empire, and every piece of music and every scientific breakthrough, fits into the last 12,000 years. The Stone Age lasted for more than 3 million years before that. 3 million years of human beings and our ancestors shaping the world with nothing but stone and fire and the extraordinary power of the human mind. When we talk about the Stone Age, we are not talking about one era. We are talking about an almost incomprehensible span of time during which our ancestors evolved from small-brain relatives of the great apes into the fully modern human beings who painted the caves of Lascaux and crossed the ocean to Australia and buried their dead with flowers and ochre and looked up at the same stars we look up at tonight and wondered what they meant. Their story is our story. The Stone Age is not something that happened to other beings in another world. It happened to us. It made us. And it is still in us, in every cell of our bodies and every fold of our minds, in ways that we are only beginning to understand. If these quiet journeys through the deep past bring you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your body grow heavy and your breathing slow. And as the night deepens around you, come with me to Africa, 3 million years ago, where a small creature is about to pick up a stone and change the world forever. Let us begin. The Stone Age began not with Homo sapiens, but with our much earlier ancestors, and a moment of invention so simple it is hard to grasp its importance. The date most scientists use for the beginning of the Stone Age is approximately 2.5 million years ago. That is when the first deliberately shaped stone tools appear in the archaeological record, found in sites in Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania. These earliest tools are called Oldowan tools, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where some of the most important early finds were made. They are not impressive objects to modern eyes. They are rocks, sharp-edged rocks, carefully shaped by striking one stone against another to produce a cutting edge, a flake struck from a core to create a blade, the core itself used as a chopper. They are simple, they are humble, and they represent one of the most consequential inventions in the history of life on Earth. The creature that made them was not us. 2.5 million years ago, Homo sapiens did not exist. The maker of the earliest stone tools was most likely a species called Homo habilis, which means handy man in Latin, a name that reflects the discovery of these tools alongside its fossils. Homo habilis was small. Its brain was considerably smaller than ours. It walked upright, but not with the smooth, efficient gait of modern humans. It looked to our eyes much more like an ape than a person. And yet, it made tools. It looked at a stone and saw within it a sharp edge waiting to be released. It understood that striking one stone against another in the right place and at the right angle would produce something more useful than either stone alone. That understanding, that ability to see potential in the physical world, and to transform it through deliberate action is the beginning of everything. It is the first faint expression of the technological intelligence that would eventually carry human beings to the moon. The Oldowan tools were used to cut meat from bones, to crack bones open to extract the nutritious marrow within, and possibly to process plant foods. They gave their makers access to sources of nutrition that would otherwise have been unavailable. And over hundreds of thousands of years, that nutritional advantage began to have effects on the bodies and the brains of the creatures that possessed it. The world that the earliest stone tool makers lived in was a world in motion, a world of dramatic change. Africa, 2.5 million years ago, was not the Africa we know today. The climate was shifting. The great forests that had covered much of the continent were contracting. The grasslands were expanding, and the creatures that had evolved in the forests were being pushed out onto the open savanna, where the rules of survival were different and where new opportunities awaited those who could adapt. The savanna was a landscape of abundance and danger in equal measure. There were enormous herds of animals, wildebeest and zebra and antelope, in numbers that matched or exceeded the great migrations of today. There were predators of extraordinary power, saber-toothed cats and enormous hyenas and leopards and lions that made the open grassland a dangerous place for a small bipedal creature with no great strength and no claws and no speed. Our ancestors were not the apex predators of their world. They were somewhere in the middle of the food chain, clever and adaptable and always vulnerable. The stone tools they made changed that calculation. A sharp stone flake could cut through the hide of a large animal that no unaided hand could penetrate. It could expose the meat and the marrow that represented a concentration of calories and protein far richer than the fruits and leaves and roots that most of their contemporaries were eating. And access to that richer diet, maintained over generations and then over hundreds of thousands of years, began to feed the organ that would eventually make our species the most powerful on the planet: the brain. The human brain is the most metabolically expensive organ in the body, and feeding it required a revolution in diet. The human brain is remarkable in ways that go far beyond what any other animal possesses. It is 3 times larger relative to body size than the brain of our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. It is capable of language and abstract reasoning and forward planning and artistic creation and mathematical thought at a level that no other animal approaches. And it is extraordinarily expensive to run. The human brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy budget, while accounting for only about 2% of body weight. This is a brain that costs an enormous amount to maintain, and that cost had to be paid somehow. The shift toward a diet richer in meat and marrow, made possible by stone tools, is one of the key factors that allowed the brain to grow. More calories, more protein, more fat, more fuel for the most expensive organ evolution had ever produced. The relationship between tool use and brain growth was not a simple one-way street. Better tools required better brains to make and use them. Better brains produced better tools. Each drove the other in an escalating cycle that over the course of 2.5 million years produced the human mind in all its extraordinary complexity. We made the tools, and the tools made us. That is one of the most important sentences in the entire story of human evolution. We are the species that remade itself through its own inventions. Homo erectus was the great traveller of the Stone Age, and it changed the world by leaving Africa. Around 1.5 to 2 million years ago, A new species appeared in Africa. Homo erectus, upright man. Homo erectus was taller than its predecessors and more robustly built. Its brain was larger than Homo habilis. Its face was flatter and more human-looking. It walked with a gait remarkably similar to our own, and it made better tools. The tools associated with Homo erectus are called Acheulean tools, named after a site in France where they were first recognized. The most characteristic Acheulean tool is the hand axe, and the hand axe is a different kind of object from the simple alderwood flakes. It is shaped on both faces to produce a symmetrical teardrop form with a pointed tip and cutting edges along both sides. It fits the hand beautifully. It can cut and chop and scrape and dig. It is a multi-purpose tool of considerable effectiveness. And it is beautiful. That beauty is not accidental. The symmetry of a well-made Acheulean hand axe goes beyond what is strictly necessary for its function. A rougher tool would cut just as well. The careful symmetry, the attention to the overall form of the object, suggests that the maker had an aesthetic sense, a concept of what the tool should look like that went beyond pure utility. Some researchers have argued that the hand axe was also a display object, a demonstration of skill and intelligence that signaled to potential mates and rivals the quality of the mind that made it. A perfectly made hand axe is the Stone Age equivalent of a peacock's tail. Beautiful beyond necessity, a signal of fitness. Whether or not this is entirely true, the hand axe tells us something important about the mind of Homo erectus. It was a mind that had aesthetic preferences, a mind that cared about form as well as function. A mind, in other words, that was beginning to be recognizably human. Homo erectus did something no earlier hominin had done. It left Africa. We do not know exactly when the first members of our genus walked out of Africa, but by around 1.5 million years ago, and possibly earlier, Homo erectus populations were established in Asia. Fossils have been found in Georgia, in the Caucasus, dating to approximately 1.5 million years ago. Fossils from Java in Indonesia date to roughly the same period, or perhaps earlier. Fossils from China span a long period and include the famous Peking man discovered at Zhoukoudian in the 1920s. The dispersal of Homo erectus across 3 continents was one of the most significant events in the history of our lineage. It meant that for the first time, a member of the human family was not simply an African creature, but a global one, adapting to the very different environments of temperate Asia and the tropical islands of Southeast Asia and the cold highlands of the Caucasus. Each population faced different challenges and developed different adaptations. And for hundreds of thousands of years, they did this in isolation from each other, evolving separately in their different corners of the old world. The world of Homo erectus was a world of separated populations, each finding its own way in its own landscape. It was a world very different from the connected global civilization of today, but it was the world in which the human family first spread beyond its African birthplace and began the long process of becoming a planetary species. Fire was the invention that transformed everything, and the debate about when we controlled it is one of the most fascinating in all of science. At some point in the long story of the Stone Age, one of our ancestors did something that changed the relationship between the human lineage and the natural world more completely than anything before or since. They controlled fire. The question of exactly when this happened is one of the most actively debated in the field of human evolution. The evidence is difficult to interpret because distinguishing between fire that was used deliberately and fire caused by lightning or other natural sources requires careful analysis of burnt materials and the contexts in which they are found. Some sites in South Africa suggest possible fire use as long ago as 1 million years. Sites in Israel provide compelling evidence of controlled fire use around 790,000 years ago. The hearths at Zhoukoudian in China, associated with Homo erectus, suggest fire use perhaps 500,000 years ago, though some of this evidence has been reinterpreted. What is clear is that by the time anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record around 300,000 years ago, fire was an established and essential part of human life. The consequences of controlling fire were profound beyond measure. Cooking transformed the human diet. Heat breaks down the tough cell walls of plants and denatures proteins. In meat, making food both safer to eat and easier to digest. A cooked diet extracts more calories from the same amount of food. It reduces the time and energy required for chewing and digestion, and it allowed the human gut to shrink, freeing up energy that could be redirected to the brain. Fire kept predators away at night. It provided warmth in cold climates that would otherwise have been uninhabitable. It extended the productive hours of the day into the darkness after sunset, and it created the hearth, the gathering place around which the social life of early human groups organized itself, where stories were told and skills were demonstrated and relationships were maintained, and the accumulated knowledge of the group was transmitted from those who knew to those who needed to learn. The hearth is the ancestor of every classroom that has ever existed, and fire is the technology that made it possible. The Neanderthals were not the brutish cave dwellers of popular imagination, but a sophisticated and fully human people. For a very long time, the Neanderthals were the embarrassing relatives of the human family tree. Their name became a byword for stupidity and brutishness. They were imagined as stooped, hairy, grunting creatures who were swept aside by the arrival of superior modern humans. The archaeological evidence has dismantled this image completely. Neanderthals were people, fully capable, cognitively complex people who had lived in Europe and Western Asia for around 300,000 years before our own species arrived. They made sophisticated stone tools of a type called Mousterian technology that required considerable skill and planning to produce. They controlled fire and used it regularly. They hunted large and dangerous animals, including mammoths and cave bears and woolly rhinoceroses, with spears that required both the skill to make and the courage to use effectively. They buried their dead. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, Neanderthal burials have been found in which the body was placed with care and intention in a way that strongly suggests a belief in something beyond simple physical death. One of the most famous is at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where a Neanderthal burial was found surrounded by pollen, suggesting that flowers had been placed with the dead. Whether these flowers were deliberate offerings or arrived by other means has been debated ever since. But the care with which Neanderthals treated their dead in site after site across their range speaks to a community life and an emotional world that was recognizably human. They cared for their injured and their sick. The skeleton of an older Neanderthal man found at Shanidar showed injuries so severe that he could not have survived without sustained care from his group. His arm had been amputated or had withered. He had suffered blows to the head and damage to his eye socket. He had arthritis throughout his body, and yet he had survived for years after these injuries. Someone fed him. Someone protected him. Someone considered his life worth sustaining even when he could no longer contribute to the group's survival. That is compassion. And compassion is one of the most distinctively human qualities we possess. The Neanderthals and modern humans met, and they had children together, and the evidence of that meeting lives in our DNA. Neanderthals were not simply replaced by modern humans. The story is far more interesting than that. Modern humans arrived in Europe and Western Asia from Africa, beginning around 60,000 years ago. They moved into a landscape that Neanderthals had inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years, and the two populations met. We know this because we can read it in our DNA. Modern humans outside Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. That percentage is the legacy of interbreeding between the two populations in the long period of contact and overlap. Real families formed across that boundary. Children were born who were part Neanderthal and part modern human. Some of those children had children of their own, and their descendants are us. The Neanderthal contribution to the modern human genome is not merely a curiosity of genetics. Some of the Neanderthal variants in modern human DNA are associated with immune system function and may have helped our ancestors resist diseases that they encountered in the new environments they were colonizing. The Neanderthals gave us something. They gave us adaptations they had spent thousands of generations developing for the particular challenges of the European and Asian environments. We carry those adaptations in our bodies today. And then, around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. Whether they were outcompeted, whether they were absorbed into the expanding modern human population, whether disease or climate change played a role, remains actively debated. What is certain is that the people who had held Europe through ice ages and warm periods and every environmental challenge for 300,000 years disappeared from the record. They left behind their tools and their bones and their genes. And in those genes they are still here, still part of us, still contributing to the bodies of the people reading this and listening to this in the 21st century. The Neanderthals did not end. They became us. The arrival of anatomically modern humans in Europe marked the beginning of a creative explosion that transformed the human story. When Homo sapiens, anatomically modern human beings, arrived in Europe around 40 to 45,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. The archaeological record changed. It changed so dramatically and so quickly that researchers have called the period that followed the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or sometimes the Creative Explosion. The tools became more diverse and more sophisticated. Personal ornaments appeared, shells pierced for stringing, teeth and ivory beads. Objects carried hundreds of miles from their source, as evidence of exchange networks and social connections that spanned enormous distances. And then came the art, the cave paintings, the carved figurines, the bone flutes. The art of the Upper Paleolithic is among the most astonishing evidence of human creative capacity ever discovered. The painted caves of southwestern France and northern Spain are the most famous examples, but they are not the only ones. In Indonesia, at sites on the island of Sulawesi, researchers have found paintings of pigs and hand stencils that are at least 44,000 years old, possibly older. These are among the oldest figurative artworks ever found. They demonstrate that the impulse to make images of the world, to take pigment and apply it to stone in the shape of a living creature, appeared very early in the human story, and appeared not just in one place, but in multiple places simultaneously. It is as if the capacity for art was already present in the minds of our ancestors. waiting only for the right conditions to express itself. And when it expressed itself, the results were breathtaking. The cave paintings of the Upper Paleolithic are 40,000 years old, and they still make people stop in their tracks. The cave of Chauvet in the Ardèche region of France was discovered in 1994 by 3 cavers who squeezed through a narrow opening and found themselves in a gallery of extraordinary paintings. Lions and rhinos and mammoths and cave bears and horses rendered in black charcoal with a confidence and a naturalism that experts initially refused to believe could be as old as the dates suggested. Surely, paintings this good, this accomplished, this sophisticated, could not be 32,000 years old. But they are. The Chauvet artists understood shading. They used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their animals volume and presence. They arranged groups of animals in compositions that suggest not just individual creatures, but herds, relationships, movement. A panel of horses at Chauvet shows multiple animals overlapping in a way that creates a sense of depth and motion that any modern artist would be proud of. At Lascaux in the Dordogne, discovered in 1940 by 4 teenage boys following a dog into a hole in the ground, the Hall of the Bulls contains paintings of aurochs and horses and deer on a scale, and with a confidence that has led people to call it the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory. At Altamira in Spain, a ceiling covered in bison, in postures of rolling and resting and bellowing, captures the weight and the life of the animals with a fidelity that astonished the 19th century scholars who refused to believe they were prehistoric. These paintings were not made casually. Getting to the deepest parts of the caves where the most elaborate paintings are often found required crawling through narrow passages in absolute darkness, with only animal fat lamps for light. The paintings were made in disorienting spaces where the flickering lamplight would have made the animals seem to move. The effort involved and the deliberateness of the choice of location tells us that these were not doodles. They were intentional acts of enormous significance. Whatever they meant to the people who made them, and we will never know for certain what that was, they mattered. They mattered enough to justify the effort of going deep into the earth and spending hours in the cold and the dark, making images of extraordinary quality that very few people would ever see. The hand stencils on cave walls are the most direct connection between us and the people of the Stone Age. Among all the images in the painted caves, the hand stencils have a particular power. Someone pressed their hand against the stone and blew pigment around it, leaving a negative image of their hand that has survived on that cave wall for 30,000 years and more. It is the most personal mark the past can leave. Not a symbol or an abstract image, but the actual shape of an actual human hand belonging to an actual person who stood in that cave at some point in the deep past and decided, for reasons we can only imagine, to leave their mark. Some of the hand stencils in the caves are small, children's hands, which means that children were present in these spaces, that the cave art was not exclusively the work of adult specialists, but something in which younger members of the community also participated. At the cave of Cosca in France, now accessible only underwater because sea level rise has submerged the entrance, hand stencils appear alongside paintings of seals and great auks and horses and bison, made by people who lived beside a sea that was hundreds of meters lower than it is today. Their world has vanished beneath the waves. Their handprints remain. The Stone Age people of Europe were not just artists. They were sophisticated technologists who understood materials and physics in ways that took modern science centuries to catch up with. The image of Stone Age people, as crude and simple, is contradicted at every turn by the archaeological evidence. The bone needles found at Upper Paleolithic sites are some of the most revealing objects in the entire record. They are tiny, carefully made from bone, with an eye pierced through the thick end for thread. They are so small and so precisely made that they are barely distinguishable from a modern sewing needle. And they tell us that Stone Age people were making fitted, sewn clothing, not simply wrapping themselves in unshaped hides, but cutting and sewing garments with seams and joints that fitted the body closely and could trap air and retain heat in the way that loose drapes never can. Fitted clothing is the difference between surviving the deep cold of an Ice Age European winter and dying from exposure in a matter of hours. The needles that made it possible are among the most important inventions of the entire Stone Age. The atlatl, or spear thrower, was another technological leap of enormous significance. This simple device, a short rod with a hooked end, acts as an extension of the throwing arm and dramatically increases the speed and force with which a dart or light spear can be launched. A skilled user of an atlatl can throw a dart with enough force and enough range to kill a large animal at a distance that keeps the hunter well clear of any danger. It is the application of the physics of levers to the problem of hunting, and it transformed the relationship between human hunters and their prey. Some Herculean hand axes are decorated with carvings. Atlatls from French cave sites are carved with extraordinary animal figures. The famous mammoth ivory atlatl, carved in the shape of a mammoth, shows an animal rendered with such accuracy and such life that it could only have been made by someone who had spent a great deal of time watching real mammoths. Function and beauty, as in so much Stone Age technology, were not separable. The tool was also the art. The social life of Stone Age people was rich and complex and extended far beyond the immediate group. Stone Age people did not live in isolation. The evidence for this comes from a source that surprises many people. Seashells. At Stone Age sites far from the sea, hundreds of miles inland, archaeologists have found seashells that have been pierced for stringing and worn as personal ornaments. The presence of these shells at inland sites tells us that people were either traveling very long distances or that objects were being passed from group to group along chains of exchange relationships that carried them hundreds of miles from their origin. Either interpretation requires a social world that extended far beyond the immediate band of 20 or 30 people who formed the basic unit of Stone Age life. Similar evidence comes from the raw materials used to make tools. Flint and obsidian of specific geological origins appear at sites far from the nearest source. This means movement. This means contact. This means relationship. Stone Age people were not trapped in tiny, isolated territories. They were connected to other people across enormous distances through networks of exchange and alliance and kinship that served as the insurance system of the Stone Age world. If your group had a bad season, if the herds moved or the rains failed or disease struck your community, the relationships you had maintained with other groups could be called upon for support. Those relationships were built and maintained through the exchange of gifts, through the movement of marriage partners between groups, through the gatherings that brought multiple bands together at certain seasons and certain locations to share information and renew connections. The shells were not just decorations. They were tokens of a social world far more complex and far more connected than the simple image of isolated cave dwellers suggests. The burial practices of the Upper Paleolithic tell us that Stone Age people believed in something beyond death. The treatment of the dead is one of the most revealing aspects of any culture. What a community does with its dead tells us what that community believes about life and about what lies beyond it. The burials of the Upper Paleolithic are among the most eloquent testimonies in the entire Stone Age record. At Sungir in Russia, burials were found dating to around 30,000 years ago that stopped researchers in their tracks. An older man had been buried with more than 2,500 ivory beads that had been sewn onto his clothing. Alongside him were buried a boy and a girl, laid head to head, each decorated with thousands more beads and with carved ivory objects and fox teeth ornaments and ochre that covered their bodies in red. The effort involved in producing those beads alone was staggering. Each bead would have required perhaps an hour of careful work. To produce the thousands found in these burials would have taken years of dedicated effort. This is not the burial of people who were simply disposed of. This is the burial of people who were honored, people who were equipped for something that was expected to come after death, people whose community believed that their existence did not simply end when their body stopped working. Whether that belief was in an afterlife in any sense we would recognize, or in something quite different, the beads and the ochre and the grave goods speak of a spiritual life and a conception of human identity that extended beyond the physical and the immediate. The Stone Age people who buried their dead with thousands of hours of labor were people who had thoughts and feelings and beliefs that we can recognize across the enormous distance of time that separates us from them. The Mesolithic was the world between the Ice Age and the invention of farming, and it was a world of remarkable richness. When the last Ice Age ended around 11,700 years ago, the world changed with a speed that was dramatic, even on a human timescale. The ice retreated. The sea levels rose. Landscapes that had been frozen tundra became forests. The mammoth steppe that had covered vast areas of Europe and Asia contracted and fragmented. The great animals of the Ice Age, the mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses, and the cave lions and the Irish elk, disappeared in the wave of extinction that followed the warming. Human populations had to adapt to a world that was changing faster than any of their traditions had evolved to deal with. The period that followed is called the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. It is the period between the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of farming, and it lasted from around 11,000 to around 6,000 years ago, depending on the region. The Mesolithic world was in many ways richer and more comfortable than the world that had preceded it. The forests that now covered much of Europe and Western Asia were full of deer and boar and aurochs and beaver and fish. The coasts and rivers offered shellfish and salmon and eel in quantities that could support substantial and settled communities. The Mesolithic people were not the desperate wanderers of popular imagination. In many areas, they were well-fed, healthy, living in communities that had developed sophisticated knowledge of their local environments, and that had the time and the security to develop rich cultural lives. The Mesolithic cemetery at Skatholm in Sweden contains the burials of hundreds of individuals who show evidence of good nutrition and relatively long lives. They were buried with care and with grave goods that suggest a complex social world. They were successful people. They were thriving. The invention of the bow and arrow was a technological revolution that transformed hunting and eventually warfare. Among the innovations of the late Stone Age, the bow and arrow stands as one of the most consequential. The atlatl had already extended the effective range and force of the human throw. The bow went further. A powerful bow can propel a light arrow at speeds and with forces that are simply beyond the physical capability of a throwing arm assisted by any lever device. It can do so accurately at ranges that allow a hunter to kill an animal without alarming the rest of the herd. It is silent, it is fast, and it is reusable. The bow appears in the archaeological record at different times in different places, but evidence for its use goes back at least 65,000 years in southern Africa and becomes common across Eurasia in the Mesolithic period. For the people of the Mesolithic forest, hunting deer and boar through dense woodland, the bow was transformative. It allowed them to hunt from concealment, to take animals without entering into close and dangerous contact with them, to feed their communities with a reliability and an efficiency that the spear and the atlatl could not match in the forested landscapes of the post-glacial world. But the bow was not only a hunting weapon. The same qualities that made it effective against animals made it effective against people. Some of the Mesolithic skeletons from European sites show evidence of arrow wounds. Violence between human groups is not an invention of civilization. It is as old as the bow, and the bow is very old indeed. The first dogs appeared in the Stone Age, and the partnership between humans and wolves changed both species forever. At some point during the Stone Age, in a process whose exact details remain debated by scientists, the most extraordinary interspecies relationship in the history of life on Earth began. A wolf, or more accurately, a population of wolves, began associating with human groups. The process was probably gradual and probably mutual. Wolves that were less fearful of humans, that could tolerate the smells and the noises and the unpredictable movements of a human camp, discovered that proximity to humans had advantages: scraps of food, protection from rival predators, the warmth of a fire in cold weather. The humans, in turn, discovered that the wolves were useful. Their extraordinary sense of smell could detect approaching danger, long before any human nose could. Their speed and their instinct for pursuit made them effective partners in hunting. Over generations, the wolves that did best in the company of humans were the ones that were calmer and more responsive to human communication. Selection favored the traits that made them better companions. And over hundreds of generations, those selected traits produced something new. Not a wolf, exactly. Something more flexible. Something more attuned to the human world. A dog. The genetic evidence suggests that dogs were domesticated from wolves somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, possibly in Eurasia, possibly in more than one place simultaneously. The exact timing and location remain areas of active research. What is clear is that by the end of the Stone Age, dogs were present in human communities across Eurasia. They are found in burials alongside their human companions, which suggests that the bond between people and dogs was considered worth acknowledging, even in death. The dog is the oldest domestic animal. It is the companion that has been with us longer than the sheep or the goat or the cow. And the relationship between our species began not in a farm or a village, but in the deep time of the Stone Age, when a wolf decided that a human camp was worth approaching, and a human decided that the wolf was worth feeding. Göbekli Tepe is the most astonishing archaeological discovery of the 20th century. and it rewrote the story of the Stone Age. In the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site in southeastern Turkey that had been noted by American researchers decades earlier, but assumed to be a medieval cemetery. What Schmidt found beneath the surface of the hill was something that should not have existed. Massive, T-shaped stone pillars, some of them more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circles and decorated with carved reliefs of animals. Foxes and gazelles and snakes and vultures and scorpions and boars, rendered with extraordinary skill and precision. The site dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, before pottery, before farming, before any of the things that scholars had assumed were necessary preconditions for monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, by people who had no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no metal tools, just stone tools and human hands, and an organizational capacity and a motivation powerful enough to quarry and transport and erect 20-ton stone pillars, at a time when the conventional story of human development said they should not have been capable of anything of the kind. The discovery shattered the assumption that religion and monumental architecture were consequences of agriculture, that only settled farming communities had the surplus and the organization to build on this scale. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. Perhaps religion and the gathering of people for shared ritual came first. Perhaps it was the need to gather for ceremonies, to maintain the social connections and the shared beliefs that bound the scattered hunter-gatherer bands of the region together, that eventually drove the development of the permanent settlements that would become the first farming villages. Perhaps civilization did not begin with food. Perhaps it began with faith. The Neolithic Revolution was the most consequential change in human history, and it was not a single event, but a slow transformation across millennia. Farming did not appear suddenly on a particular Tuesday morning when some inspired individual looked at a wild grain plant and thought about planting it. It was a process, a slow, gradual, often reversible process that took thousands of years to play out, and that happened independently in multiple places around the world, in response to the particular conditions of the post-Ice Age world. The first signs of the transition from hunting and gathering to cultivation appear in the region of the Middle East, known as the Fertile Crescent, around 10 to 12,000 years ago. The plants involved were the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, grasses with large edible seeds that grew naturally on the hills and valleys of the Levant and Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. Human communities had been harvesting these wild grains for thousands of years before anyone began deliberately planting them. The transition from harvesting to planting, from following the grain to growing it, was not a sudden leap, but a gradual intensification of a relationship between people and plants that had been developing for a very long time. Similar processes happened independently in China, where rice and millet were domesticated in the valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze. In the Americas, where maize was developed from a wild grass called teosinte in the highlands of Mexico. In sub-Saharan Africa, where sorghum and millet were brought under cultivation. In New Guinea, where taro and yams were being cultivated perhaps 9,000 years ago. Farming was not borrowed or diffused from a single source. It was invented multiple times by multiple peoples in response to similar pressures and opportunities. The human mind, it turns out, tends to find the same solutions to the same problems, regardless of geography or culture or time. The problems of feeding a growing population in a changing world produced, again and again and independently, the same answer: grow your own. Stonehenge stands at the end of the Stone Age as its most enduring monument and its most enduring mystery. The monument we know as Stonehenge was not built in a day or a decade. It was constructed and modified and elaborated over a period of approximately 1,500 years, from around 5,000 years ago to around 3,500 years ago. Its earliest phase was a circular earthwork, a ditch and bank enclosure on the chalk downland of Wiltshire in England, used as a cremation cemetery. The large standing stones that make Stonehenge recognizable came later. The blue stones, the smaller inner stones, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, more than 200 miles away, at a time when the people who moved them had no wheeled vehicles, no pulleys, no metal tools. They moved them with ropes and sledges and rollers and boats, and the collective labour of communities that must have considered this work worth doing at a cost of extraordinary effort and time. The larger sarsen stones, the tall uprights with their lintel caps that form the iconic image of Stonehenge, came from Marlborough Downs, approximately 25 miles away. Each one weighed up to 50 tons. Each one was shaped and raised with tools of stone and antler and wood by people who understood the physics of moving enormous weights with nothing more than human muscle and human ingenuity. What was Stonehenge for? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. Its alignment with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset tells us that it had a calendrical function and that the movements of the sun were important to the people who built it. Its use as a cremation cemetery, in its earliest phase, suggests associations with death and possibly with ancestors. The bones of people from across Britain have been found within its earthwork, which suggests that it was a place of gathering and perhaps of pilgrimage for communities from a wide area. It was a place where people came, a place that mattered, a place that generations of people over 15 centuries considered worth building and rebuilding and adding to, that sustained commitment, that willingness to invest effort and resources across generations in the maintenance of a shared monument tells us something important about the society that produced it. It was a society with long memories and shared beliefs, and the organizational capacity to pursue collective projects that outlasted the lifetime of any individual. It was, in other words, a civilization, still Stone Age in its technology, but fully human in its ambitions. The Stone Age made us, and its legacy lives in every part of who we are. The Stone Age is over, has been over for thousands of years, and yet it is not gone. It is present in us in ways both obvious and profound. Our bodies were shaped by the Stone Age. The upright posture that allows us to see over the grass of the savannah, the long legs that make us extraordinary long-distance runners, the hands with their precise grip that can hold both a spear and a paintbrush, the eyes that see colour brilliantly, evolved to detect ripe fruit among green leaves, the brain that processes social information with extraordinary complexity, because living in a group and navigating its relationships was the challenge that shaped our intelligence more than any other. We are Stone Age bodies, living in a world our Stone Age ancestors could not have imagined. And the mismatch between the world we evolved for and the world we now inhabit explains many of the challenges of modern life in ways that become clear only when we understand where we came from. Our minds were shaped by the Stone Age, the love of story, the need for community, the fear of darkness and of large predators, the hunger for fat and sugar that served us well on the savannah and serves us less well in a world of supermarkets, the instinct to track faces and to read intentions that makes us see faces in clouds and in the grain of wood, the capacity for music and art and ritual that appears in every human culture that has ever existed, because it appeared first in the caves of the Upper Paleolithic and has never left us. We are not post-Stone Age in any meaningful sense. We are Stone Age people who have built extraordinary things on top of the foundations that the Stone Age laid. The tools we use have changed beyond recognition. The minds that use them are the same minds that shaped the first hand axe and painted the first horse on a cave wall and stood over the first burial and wondered what came next. 3 million years of stone and fire and survival and creativity produced you. Everything you think and feel and create and imagine has its deepest roots in the Stone Age. And when you look up at the stars tonight, you are doing something that people have been doing for as long as there have been people. Looking up, wondering, reaching for something beyond the immediate and the visible. The Stone Age is not the past. It is the foundation on which everything else was built, and it has never entirely gone away. And so, we come gently to the end of our long journey through the Stone Age. We have stood on the African savannah 2.5 million years ago and watched our ancestor pick up a stone and strike it against another and see the sharp edge that fell away. We have crouched around the first controlled fire and felt the warmth that changed everything. We have followed Homo erectus out of Africa and across a continent into landscapes no member of our family had ever seen. We have stood in Shanidar Cave and understood that the Neanderthal who cared for his injured companion was a person in every sense that matters. We have crawled through the narrow passages of Chauvet and Lascaux and held our lamp up to the painted walls and been stopped in our tracks by the bison and the horses and the lions that someone put there 30,000 years ago. We have pressed our hand against the stone and blown pigment around it and left a mark that has outlasted every empire. We have followed the first dogs to the edges of the first human camps and understood that the partnership we formed then has never ended. We have stood before the stone circles of Stonehenge and felt the weight of 15 centuries of human faith and effort in every stone. And we have understood that the Stone Age was not a primitive beginning that we have left far behind. It was the making of us. It made our bodies and our minds and our capacity for love and grief and creativity and belief. It gave us the tools and the fire and the art and the social bonds that everything else has been built upon. We did not leave the Stone Age behind. We carried it with us. It is in us right now, in the hands that made those first tools and the hands that hold this device, in the eyes that tracked prey across the savannah and the eyes reading these words, in the minds that looked at the stars 3 million years ago and the minds looking at them tonight. If this quiet journey through the deepest chapter of the human story brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment, there is nothing more to follow. Let the Stone Age settle into its ancient silence Let the cave fires burn down to embers. Let the painted animals rest in their darkness. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The Stone Age has kept its watch long enough for one night. Sleep well. Good night. The Denisovans were a third kind of human being whose existence was revealed not by fossils, but by a finger bone found in a cave in Siberia. In 2010, researchers analyzing a tiny fragment of finger bone found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia made a discovery that rewrote the human family tree. The DNA extracted from that fragment did not match Neanderthal DNA, and it did not match modern human DNA. It belonged to a previously unknown kind of human being that we now call the Denisovans, named after the cave where the fragment was found. We know almost nothing about what the Denisovans looked like. The physical remains recovered from Denisova Cave amount to a finger bone, a few teeth, and a fragment of jaw. Not enough to reconstruct a face or a body, but the DNA from those fragments tells us extraordinary things. The Denisovans were distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans, but related to both. They shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals approximately 400,000 years ago, and they interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans in the periods of contact and overlap that characterized the late Stone Age. The genetic legacy of the Denisovans is still present in living human populations. People from Papua New Guinea and Australia and other parts of Oceania carry between 3 and 5% Denisovan DNA. Tibetans carry a Denisovan variant of a gene that helps them function at high altitude with less oxygen than other people need. This variant, which makes the Tibetan adaptation to high-altitude life possible, came from the Denisovans, a vanished people that we know almost entirely through fragments of bone and the genetic traces they left in living human populations, gave the Tibetan people the ability to live on the roof of the world. The Stone Age human family was not a simple two-species story of modern humans replacing Neanderthals. It was a complex web of interrelated populations moving across Eurasia over hundreds of thousands of years, meeting and separating and mixing and diverging, leaving their genes in each other and in us. We are the product of all of them, not just the modern humans who left Africa, but the Neanderthals who received them, and the Denisovans who met them somewhere in the east, and all the other populations whose stories we have not yet recovered, because their bones have not been found, or have not yet yielded up their secrets. The Paleolithic people of Australia were among the most accomplished navigators of the ancient world. The arrival of human beings in Australia is one of the most remarkable achievements of the Stone Age. Getting to Australia, even at the time of lowest sea level, when the land masses of Eurasia and Oceania were at their closest, required crossing at least 60 kilometers of open ocean. There was no land bridge. There was no way to walk to Australia. The people who got there had to build watercraft of some kind and navigate open water in a deliberate and planned crossing. They did this at least 50,000 years ago, possibly 65,000 years ago, based on the most recent dating of archaeological sites. These were not accidental voyages. Crossing 60 kilometers of open ocean requires purposeful navigation. It requires knowledge of currents and winds and stars. It requires the ability to build vessels capable of carrying people and supplies. And it requires the organizational capacity to coordinate a crossing involving enough people to establish a viable founding population. This was a planned expedition into the unknown. The people who undertook it had no idea what lay on the other side. They could not have seen Australia from the islands they were leaving. They sailed into genuinely unknown water with nothing but their skill and their courage and their stone tools. When they arrived, they found a continent of extraordinary abundance and extraordinary strangeness. Animals unlike anything they had ever seen. Plants and landscapes utterly different from the tropical environments they had left. They adapted. They spread across the continent with remarkable speed and developed the oldest continuous culture on Earth. A culture that persists in the indigenous peoples of Australia today and that represents the most ancient, unbroken human tradition in the world. The rock art of the Stone Age spans the globe, and each tradition tells a different story about the same human imagination. The cave paintings of France and Spain are the most famous Stone Age art, but the human impulse to make images of the world found expression on every inhabited continent. In Australia, the oldest rock art may be 65,000 years old or more, based on the dating of sites where pigment has been found in contexts that suggest very early occupation. The art of the Australian Aboriginal tradition includes images of animals that are now extinct, including the giant wombat Diprotodon and other megafauna that disappeared from Australia around 45,000 years ago. These images are records of a world that no longer exists, painted by people who watched the last of those great animals and left their images on stone for the future. In Africa, at sites like Blombus Cave in South Africa, evidence of symbolic and artistic behavior goes back further still. Ochre engraved with geometric patterns and perforated shells strung as beads have been found at Blombos Cave, dating to around 75 to 100,000 years ago. These are not figurative images of animals. They are abstract patterns and personal ornaments, but they are symbolic. They demonstrate that the capacity for symbolic thought and symbolic expression was present in our ancestors long before the famous cave paintings of Europe. In the Americas, the earliest rock art appears in sites from Patagonia to the Yukon and includes both figurative and abstract imagery of great beauty and complexity. The Sierra de San Francisco rock paintings in Mexico, the cave paintings of Serra da Capivara in Brazil, the petroglyphs of Newspaper Rock in Utah all speak to a tradition of image making that was established across the Americas in the millennia following the first human arrival. The rock art of the world is a record of 3 million years of human imagination, expressed in every medium that stone and pigment and human hands could produce. It is the longest artistic tradition in history, and it began in the Stone Age. The Stone Age diet was more varied and more sophisticated than the meat-heavy caricature suggests. Popular culture tends to imagine Stone Age people as single-minded meat-eaters who thought about little else but the next hunt. The reality was considerably more varied. Stone Age people ate everything that was edible. Meat, certainly, large animals and small ones. Fish and shellfish in enormous quantities where they were available. Birds and their eggs. Roots and tubers and leaves and berries and nuts and seeds and fungi. Honey, which provided rare concentrated sweetness and energy, and which required considerable skill and courage to obtain from wild bees. Insects, which are among the most protein-rich foods available, and which were certainly eaten by Stone Age people, as they are still eaten by hunter-gatherer communities today. The dental evidence from Stone Age skeletons shows a variety of wear patterns and food residues that confirm this dietary breadth. Chemical analysis of the bones themselves can reveal the proportions of different food sources in the diet by analyzing the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. These analyses consistently show diets that were varied and that changed seasonally and regionally in response to what was available. The Stone Age diet was not the fixed, monotonous regime that dietary fads sometimes like to invoke it as. It was flexible, it was opportunistic, it was responsive, like the mines that chose it. The grinding stones found at Stone Age sites tell us that plant processing was as important as hunting. Among the objects that appear in the archaeological record of the later Stone Age are grinding stones, flat stones with a smooth concave surface, worn by repeated grinding of plant materials against them. Smaller rounded stones used as pestles. The presence of these objects at Stone Age sites tells us that people were processing plant foods in ways that required sustained effort and specific equipment. Grinding turns hard seeds and dried roots into flour that can be mixed with water and cooked. It removes the husks from grain. It breaks down the tough cell walls of plant material to make nutrients more accessible. It is tedious work, hours of repetitive motion at a stone that bruises the knuckles and fills the air with fine dust. But it turns resources that would otherwise be indigestible or unpalatable into storable, transportable, nutritious food. The grinding stones are the ancestors of the flour mills that would eventually process grain on an industrial scale and make the great cities of the ancient world possible. They are not glamorous objects. They do not have the visual drama of a cave painting or a hand axe. But they fed people. And feeding people is the most fundamental act of civilization. The transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age was gradual and uneven, and in some places it happened much later than in others. The Stone Age did not end on a particular date. The idea of distinct ages of stone, bronze, and iron is a 19th century classification that has proved useful, but that can be misleading if taken too literally. In much of the world, the transition from stone tools to metal tools was gradual and partial, and for a long time, people used both stone and metal, depending on what was available and what the task required. In some parts of the world, the transition happened very late. In Australia, the Stone Age continued until European contact, and the stone tool traditions of Australian Aboriginal peoples reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in the final millennia before that contact. In the Pacific Islands, the settlement of the most remote islands happened within the last 2,000 years, carried out by people using stone tools and Neolithic technology to navigate and colonize the most scattered archipelagos on Earth. The Stone Age was not a stage that everyone passed through at the same time. It was a condition that different peoples inhabited at different times and left behind at different rates in response to their particular circumstances and resources and opportunities. What united them all was the fundamental technology that gave the age its name. Stone, shaped by human hands, in the service of human needs, for 3 million years of the human story. What the Stone Age tells us about ourselves is the most important thing it has to offer. After 3 million years of stone tools and fire and art and burial, and the long, slow elaboration of the human capacity, what does the Stone Age ultimately tell us? It tells us that we are an extraordinarily old species with extraordinarily deep roots. It tells us that the qualities we most value in ourselves, creativity and compassion and curiosity and the capacity for love and grief, are not recent inventions. They are not products of civilization. They were present in the Neanderthal who cared for his injured companion, and in the person who pressed their hand against the cave wall, and in the community that buried its children with thousands of ivory beads. These qualities are as old as our lineage. They are what we have always been. The Stone Age also tells us that human beings are the most adaptable creatures that evolution has ever produced. We lived in tropical forest and Arctic tundra, and temperate woodland, and open savanna. We crossed oceans and mountains and deserts. We survived ice ages and volcanic winters, and mass extinctions that wiped out the great animals that shared our world. We did it not through brute strength or physical specialization, but through intelligence and cooperation, and the ability to learn and transmit knowledge across generations. The Stone Age is the proof of all this. 3 million years of evidence that the human species is capable of surviving and adapting and creating and enduring in conditions that would destroy any less flexible creature. That resilience is our birthright. It was forged in the Stone Age, and it is still ours today. The music of the Stone Age began with bone flutes, and almost certainly with the human voice long before that. The bone flutes of the Upper Paleolithic are among the oldest musical instruments ever found. The oldest known examples, discovered at sites in Germany and Slovenia, and dating to around 40 to 43,000 years ago, are made from the wing bones of vultures and from mammoth ivory. They are carefully crafted objects with precisely positioned finger holes that would have produced a range of tones. These are not crude noisemakers. They are musical instruments in the full sense of the word, capable of melody and possibly of scales. The existence of these flutes tells us that music was already a developed and sophisticated art form 40,000 years ago. But music is certainly older than the flutes. The human voice can sing. Hands can clap and feet can stamp and hollow logs can be struck. Music does not require manufactured instruments. It requires only the human body and the human impulse to make rhythm and melody that is as universal as any characteristic of our species. Music appears in every human culture that has ever existed. No culture has been found that lacks it. This universality suggests that music is not a cultural invention, but a biological capacity, something built into the human nervous system at a level more fundamental than language or art or religion. The Stone Age flutes confirm that this capacity was expressing itself in recognizable musical instruments 40,000 years before the first cities were built. The people who played them around their fires in the Ice Age night were making music in the same way that people make music around fires, and in concert halls, and in kitchens today. The impulse has not changed, only the instruments. The Venus figurines of the Upper Paleolithic are the oldest known sculptures of the human form, and they still puzzle researchers. Among the most striking objects of the Upper Paleolithic are the small carved figurines, typically of women, found at sites across Europe and into Siberia, dating from roughly 35,000 to 11,000 years ago. They are called Venus figurines after the Roman goddess of love, a name that reflects the assumptions of the 19th century scholars who first classified them, and that may or may not be appropriate. The figurines are typically small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. They are made from a variety of materials, ivory and stone and fired clay. They tend to emphasize certain features of the female body: the breasts, the hips, the belly. The faces are often schematic or absent. The feet are often tapered, suggesting they may have been designed to be stuck into the ground or held rather than stood independently. The most famous is the Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria in 1908 and dating to around 25 to 28,000 years ago. It is a small limestone figure, barely 11 centimeters tall, carved with extraordinary attention to the rounded forms and colored with red ochre. What did these figurines mean to the people who made them? Theories abound. Fertility symbols, goddess figures, self-portraits, good luck charms, teaching aids, votive offerings, trading goods. The honest answer is that we do not know. What we do know is that people across a vast area from France to Siberia, over a period of more than 20,000 years, were making small carved representations of the human form, and that these objects were clearly important to them. The human body, represented in stone and ivory, was a subject worth spending time on, worth the effort of carving, worth keeping and carrying and perhaps passing on. The Venus figurines are the world's oldest portrait tradition, and they are Stone Age. The ochre used by Stone Age people was not simply paint, but a material of profound symbolic significance. Throughout the Stone Age, from the very earliest sites in Africa to the cave paintings of Europe to the burials of the Upper Paleolithic, one material appears again and again with a consistency that speaks to its deep importance: red ochre. Ochre is iron oxide, a mineral pigment that produces shades from yellow to red to deep blood color, depending on how it is processed and heated. It is found at Stone Age sites around the world in contexts that span the full range of human activity. It was used to make the cave paintings. It was used to color the bodies of the dead in burials. It was used to mark objects and surfaces in ways that seem to have carried symbolic meaning. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, ochre processing kits have been found dating to around 100,000 years ago. Shells used as containers and stones used as grinding tools, and ochre processed into a paint-like substance that was clearly being prepared deliberately for use. At Pinnacle Point on the South African coast, ochre use dates back at least 164,000 years. Ochre is the world's oldest pigment, with a documented history of human use that spans the entire length of the modern human story and extends back before it into the time of the earliest tool-using hominins. Why ochre? Red is the color of blood. It is the most visually striking color in the natural environment. It commands attention in a way that no other color quite matches. Whatever the symbolic meanings that Stone Age people attached to red ochre, and those meanings almost certainly varied enormously across cultures and time, the choice of red as the dominant pigment of the Stone Age connects directly to the deep human response to color that is as biological as it is cultural. Childhood in the Stone Age was longer than in almost any other mammal, and that length was not a weakness but a strength. Human childhood is extraordinarily long compared to other primates. A chimpanzee is sexually mature at 8 or 9 years old, a gorilla at 6 or 7. A human being does not reach full physical and cognitive maturity until the mid-20s. This extended childhood is not an accident or a failing. It is an adaptation. And it is one of the most important adaptations in the human evolutionary story. A long childhood is the period during which the human brain, the largest and most complex brain in the animal kingdom, develops and wires itself for the particular cultural environment into which the child has been born. A Stone Age child growing up in Ice Age Europe needed to learn an enormous amount before they could survive independently. Which plants were edible and which were poisonous. How to read animal tracks and understand animal behavior. How to make fire in wet conditions. How to knap flint without cutting yourself. How to navigate by stars and landmarks. how to understand the social dynamics of the group, and to negotiate the complex web of relationships and obligations that determine status and access to resources. All of this took time, decades of time, and the long human childhood provided that time. It was paid for in vulnerability. A human child is helpless for longer than any other primate. It requires sustained care and feeding and protection for years before it can contribute anything to its own survival. This is an enormous investment of parental and community resources. But the return on that investment is a mind capable of learning and retaining and applying knowledge at a level that no other animal can match. The long childhood of Stone Age children was the factory that produced the minds that eventually painted the caves and built Stonehenge and crossed the ocean to Australia and invented farming and writing and everything else. Every achievement of the human species is built on the foundation of that long, vulnerable, extraordinary childhood. The language of the Stone Age is gone forever, but the capacity for language shaped everything. We will never hear a Stone Age language. No recordings exist. No written records. The sounds that Stone Age people made when they spoke to each other have vanished as completely as the breath that carried them. But language itself, the capacity for it, leaves traces in the fossil record. The hyoid bone, which anchors the muscles of the tongue and throat, and is essential for the kind of fine motor control that speech requires, has been found in Neanderthal skeletons, in a form virtually identical to our own. The FOXP2 gene, which in modern humans is associated with language and speech, appears in Neanderthal DNA in a form almost identical to the human version. These pieces of evidence suggest that Neanderthals had at least the biological capacity for spoken language, even if we cannot know how they used it. The evidence from modern humans is clearer. Our vocal tract is shaped for complex speech. Our brains have regions specifically dedicated to language production and comprehension that have no parallel in any other species. We are, in the most fundamental biological sense, a speaking animal. And language, once it exists, transforms everything. Language allows the accumulation of culture across generations in a way that no other form of communication can match. It allows the transmission of knowledge about things that are not present, not visible, not immediate. It allows planning and coordination on a scale that would be impossible through gesture or example alone. It allows story. And story is how human beings make sense of the world and of their place in it. The stories told around Stone Age fires preserved knowledge about the landscape and the animals and the stars. They transmitted the beliefs and the values and the social rules of the community. They connected the living to the dead and to the generations that would come after. Language did not create the human mind, but it gave the human mind a tool whose power has no parallel in the natural world, and that tool was forged in the Stone Age. The relationship between Stone Age people and the landscape they lived in was one of profound knowledge and profound intimacy. Stone Age people knew their landscapes the way we know our city streets. Better, in fact. They knew every hill and every valley and every seasonal stream. They knew where the flint outcrops were and where the best clay for pottery could be found. They knew which rivers had salmon runs and when. They knew which meadows the deer grazed in the early morning and which thickets the boar used for cover in the middle of the day. They knew which plants flowered first in spring, and which berries were ripe in late summer, and which roots could be dug in autumn and stored through the winter. This knowledge was not written down. It could not be written down. It was held in memory, and transmitted through teaching and through story, and through the direct experience of being shown by someone who already knew. It was a different kind of knowledge from the encyclopedic and quantitative knowledge of the modern world, but it was not a lesser kind of knowledge. It was intimate, embodied, relational knowledge. Knowledge held not just in the mind, but in the hands and the feet and the nose and the eyes. A Stone Age tracker, reading the signs of an animal's passage through an unfamiliar stretch of forest, was performing an act of interpretation as sophisticated as any that a modern scientist performs in a laboratory. The data was different. The method was different. The quality of intelligence required was the same. The ochre-stained bones in the oldest burials are a direct conversation between us and the people of the Stone Age. When we excavate a Stone Age burial site, we are opening a conversation across time that has no parallel in any other kind of historical evidence. The objects placed with the dead tell us what the living valued. The position of the body tells us something about what the living believed. The ochre on the bones tells us that colour and symbolism were part of how death was understood. And the care with which all of this was arranged tells us that the people who performed these burials felt something about the death of the person they were burying that moved them to invest significant effort in the burial itself. They grieved. We cannot know the form their grief took. We cannot know the words or the songs or the ceremonies that accompanied the laying down of the body and the placing of the grave goods and the final covering of the earth. But we know the grief was real because the effort is real. People do not work hard for the dead unless the dead mattered to them. And the dead of the Stone Age mattered to the living in exactly the same way that the dead matter to the living today. That grief is the most human thing in the world, and it began in the Stone Age. It has never stopped. The animals of the Stone Age world were larger, stranger, and more dangerous than anything alive today. To walk through the landscape of the Upper Paleolithic would be to enter a world of creatures that belong in the imagination, rather than in ordinary experience. We have already spent time with the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros, and the cave lion and the cave bear. But the megafauna of the Stone Age world extended far beyond these famous animals. The Irish elk, Megaloceros giganteus, was a deer of extraordinary proportions whose antlers could span nearly 4 meters from tip to tip and weigh as much as 40 kilograms in large males. These antlers are the largest structures produced by any deer species in the evolutionary record. They appear in the cave paintings of Ice Age Europe with a distinctive profile that makes them immediately recognizable and that demonstrates the close observation of the people who painted them. The aurochs was the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, and it was nothing like its domesticated descendants. It was enormous, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with forward curving horns and a muscular build that made it one of the most formidable animals in the European landscape. Julius Caesar, who encountered aurochs in the forests of Gaul, described them as slightly smaller than elephants, and noted that they were used to display courage in Germany by young men who hunted them alone. The cave paintings of Lascaux include aurochs of such power and presence that they leap from the stone with an energy that speaks to someone who had seen these animals alive and in motion. The spotted hyena of the Ice Age was considerably larger than its modern African equivalent, and it competed directly with human hunters and with cave lions for access to the same large prey animals. Hyena remains have been found in some of the same cave systems that were used by both Neanderthals and modern humans, suggesting a complicated and sometimes dangerous three-way competition for the sheltered spaces and the food resources of the Ice Age landscape. These animals were not background scenery. They were neighbors. They were competitors. They were prey, and they were predators. Stone Age people lived alongside them and among them, and the paintings they left in the caves are among the most direct evidence we have of how closely and how carefully they observed the world of animals that surrounded them. The technology of making fire was one of the most important skills a Stone Age person could possess. Fire could not simply be assumed. In a world without matches or lighters, or any other reliable ignition source, the ability to make fire from scratch was a skill of vital importance that required knowledge of materials and considerable practice. The two main methods of making fire that Stone Age people used were percussion, striking iron pyrite against flint to produce sparks, and friction, spinning a wooden drill in a socket of softer wood until the friction produced enough heat to ignite tinder. Both methods appear in the archaeological record. Iron pyrite and flint found together at sites in contexts that suggest deliberate pairing. Fire drills and hearthboards of wood preserved in waterlogged or other exceptional conditions. Both methods require skill and knowledge. The right materials for the tinder, the right type of iron pyrite for striking, the right angle and force of the blow for percussion, the right wood combinations and the right technique for friction. A person who could reliably make fire in wet conditions, in cold weather, under pressure, was a person of real value to any group. The knowledge of how to make fire was not simply practical knowledge. It was knowledge about the nature of materials, about what burns and what does not, about how to manage heat, about how to sustain a small flame through stages of increasing fuel until a proper fire was burning. It was chemistry in its oldest form. Practical, embodied, essential chemistry. The kind of chemistry that does not need a laboratory, because the world itself is the laboratory. The migration of modern humans across the world during the Stone Age was one of the greatest journeys in the history of life. When anatomically modern humans left Africa, the journey they undertook was not a single migration, but a series of expansions and contractions and re-expansions, driven by climate change and population pressure, and the restless human impulse to see what was over the next horizon. The coastal route along the southern shore of Asia is thought to have been one of the primary pathways by which modern humans reached Southeast Asia and Australia. The low sea levels of the Ice Age period exposed enormous areas of continental shelf that are now underwater, creating wide coastal plains rich in marine resources, along which a population of skilled foragers could move rapidly. The evidence for this coastal migration is sparse, because the coastlines these people used are now under the sea. But genetic data and the timing of the earliest sites in South Asia and Southeast Asia supports the idea of a rapid coastal expansion that moved modern humans from East Africa to Australia in perhaps 10 to 20,000 years. That is fast, faster than most models of dispersal predicted. It speaks to a people of extraordinary adaptability and enterprise, moving into new environments and finding ways to live in them with a speed that leaves the conventional image of Stone Age people as cautious and conservative looking. Very inadequate indeed. They were not cautious. They were adventurous. They were curious. They moved because moving was in their nature, and because the world kept offering new horizons. and the human impulse has always been to see what was beyond them. The relationship between Stone Age communities and their territories was governed by deep knowledge accumulated across generations. A Stone Age band did not wander randomly across the landscape. It moved through a territory that was known intimately and managed through long-established patterns of movement and use. The territory of a hunter-gatherer band might cover hundreds of square kilometers, but every part of it was known. Which paths were safe in which seasons, which water sources were reliable, and which dried up in summer. Which parts of the landscape were the territories of other bands, and how relationships with those bands should be managed. The knowledge of the territory was held collectively in the memories and the stories and the songs of the community. It was transmitted from generation to generation through the process of being shown and told and experiencing directly. Elders who had lived in and moved through the territory for 50 or 60 years were the living libraries of this knowledge. Their experience of droughts and floods and exceptional seasons and the movements of herds over decades was knowledge that could save lives when conditions changed in ways that had not been seen for a generation. The value of elders in Stone Age communities was not primarily sentimental. It was practical. They knew things that nobody else knew, because they had lived long enough to see things that nobody else had seen. And in a world without written records, the knowledge in an elder's mind was irreplaceable. The moment that elder died, this is one of the deepest reasons why Stone Age people cared for their injured and their old and buried their dead with such care and such effort. Because the people they were burying had been repositories of knowledge that could not be recovered once the knowledge holder was gone. The elaborate burials of the Stone Age are, among other things, expressions of gratitude for what the dead person knew and grief at the knowledge that died with them. The coastal shell middens of the Stone Age are among the most information-rich archaeological sites in the world. Along the coasts of every continent that was inhabited in the Stone Age human communities, left behind a particular kind of site that has proved extraordinarily valuable to archaeologists. Shell middens, enormous accumulations of discarded shells, the remains of the shellfish that formed such an important part of coastal diets, mixed with the bones of fish and birds and mammals, and the ashes of fires, and the stone tools used for processing food, and occasionally the bones of the people who ate there. These middens can be enormous. Some of the shell middens of the South African coast are meters deep and cover areas of hundreds of square meters. They represent thousands of years of repeated occupation by communities that return to the same productive coastal locations, generation after generation. The shells in a midden are not just food waste. They are data. The species present tell us what was being eaten. The sizes of the shells tell us about the health of the shellfish populations and whether they were being sustainably harvested or overexploited. Seasonal indicators in the shell growth layers can tell us what time of year the site was occupied. Chemical signatures in the shells can tell us about past sea temperatures and climates. The entire history of a coastal community and its environment is encoded in the shell midden, waiting for the right questions and the right techniques to decode it. These are archives of the Stone Age world, as detailed and as rich in information as any written record. They are just written in a different language, the language of shells and bones and ash and stone, and learning to read them is one of the great intellectual achievements of modern archaeology.